All right, how's everybody doing tonight? Okay. Week 3 is where we're at. We're going to be covering tonight settings and contrasts. For your in class tonight, we're going to be looking at your camera and finding out what settings are on your camera dial or menu and submitting those on the in class. For your take home, we'll be doing ISO and white balance. You'll have a number of areas where you'll go to and take a photo, and I'll give you instructions on that before you go. And so let's jump right into week 3 with the settings and contrast. The first one is we're going to look at exposure first, and then we're going to look at contrast second. Okay, we've talked about so far how exposure was one of the terms we talked about last week, how exposure is going to be um, one of the main categories that you use when you're deciding whether or not a photo is good or not. It's how much exposure light that photo has gotten. And remember, exposure is driven by the sensor, and it's basically the amount of light exposed to film or the image sensor on your camera. And we talked about last week how the misnomer in digital photography is that the more megapixels, the better the photo. But really, it's not the case. You can have a lower megapixel DSLR with a better quality sensor and a higher megapixel point and shoot and lower quality sensor, and you're going to have a better picture out of the DSLR with lower megapixel, because the sensor is what determines the quality of the image. And so it's controlled by, on film, the film speed, and on digital cameras, the image sensor sensitivity. Now, your point and shoots today up to mid-range cameras are fine for what most users use it for, which is going to be social media, the occasional 4x6, 8x10 photo you print out for weddings and things of that nature. It's great for that. High-end DSLRs really are when you're getting into photography beyond novice, when you're wanting to, like, say, do this for some type of beyond hobby, like some type of part-time job or full-time job. That's when you need to invest in a DSLR type of camera. Um, it's not to say, though, if you're a novice and you just want to get a better camera, after you learn all the technology and techniques this semester, you go out and purchase one just to take better photos. Definitely. But for most part, the cameras out today up to mid-range prior to DSLR are just fine for what users do today with their cameras. So light is controlled by film image sensor, sensitivity, shutter speed, and aperture. We talked about shutter speed last week as well. The speed of the shutter determines how much light and for how long the light is put in, not how much, but how long. And then the aperture is how much. Remember, a higher aperture number means smaller hole, lower aperture number means larger hole. It's also called f-stops as well, aperture is, within your cameras. Now, the amount of exposure is dependent upon the sensitivity of the capturing medium, whether it be film or image sensor. An example here is a ISO 100, which is on most cameras a low-end ISO. And you'll notice on the left side is how long the shutter speed has stayed open for. So we have 1.3 seconds all the way to 15 seconds. You notice the faster the shutter speed, the darker, because less light is let in. The more light is let in up to 15 seconds, regardless how dark it is, the lighter the scene looks. All right. I kind of juxtaposition it to your eyes. When you're in a room, when you walk into a dark room, how long does it take for your eyes to adjust to that dark room to where you can actually see enough to walk around? Roughly, like that, right? So your eyes, and we talked about this last week, are actually, if we're going to look at a technology that represents kind of what cameras do, your eyes do it and do it perfectly. But Your eyes don't take 15 seconds to adjust, it takes milliseconds to adjust. But your camera, by keeping that shutter speed basically open longer, it's going to let more light into the sensor, and it's going to brighten up the scene. Make sense? Because more light's let in. The next one is that proper exposure can make or break your picture. We talked about this already this semester. You can do a lot in post-production, but you want to really try to get the best shot the first time. When I was growing up, my first job, I worked for a person that told me, you know, if you're going to do something, do it right the first time, right? Whatever, regardless of what you do in life. And so same with photography, you want to do it right the first time, because if you're lazy in photography or you don't take your time to learn what your camera can do, yeah, you can spend more time in post-production, but why? Why do it when you can just do it right the first time? And this semester, you'll get a chance to play around with all these settings, like this week, the ISO and white balance, and exactly what it does, what it can do detrimentally to a photo and what it can do positively to a photo, either one. So exposure can change the appearance of the picture. And again, anytime you hear the word exposure, it's light. So here we have the EV on your camera, which is the exposure value that all cameras have. We'll spend a week on EV this week. We're not going to play with the EV at all. It's a few weeks down the road, I believe. But EV starts with when it's out of the box, you open the camera up, you start shooting with it, 0 is the EV value. EV value 0 is supposed to be the true light that's in the area around the camera at the time. So if we were to try to darken it up a little bit, if we think it's too bright, we can add negative EV. The more negative we go on EV, the darker the scene becomes. Notice the more positive we come, the lighter it comes on the exposure value. Exposure value, then the EV value does make or break that exposure. And again, all your cameras are going to have some type of EV. EV a lot of times looks like a plus minus button on your camera with a slash in the middle, or it might just say EV. And we'll don't worry about that right now. We'll have a whole week on EV. Histograms. All of your cameras pretty much have these for the most part. A histogram tells you the value of the image, but doesn't show you the picture itself. Okay? It's kind of like a person that reads X-rays. I've been fascinated with people that can read X-rays, right? Or people that can read, what is it? The MIR, not MIR. What is it? The MRI. Thank you. The MRI scans. All these scans that doctors can read. They go to school and they learn how to do it. It always fascinated me that they can look at a scan and go, oh yeah, this is what's going on. You've got this fracture or whatever. We've got a dark spot over here. If I was looking, I'd like, it's a dark spot. I don't know. But a person with the right eyes can see what's going on, right? Well, the histogram you're going to learn this week, a little bit tonight on what histograms do, and you'll leave tonight kind of knowing what the histogram is on your camera, what it does. You've seen it pop up maybe a time or two. Maybe you've even seen it on some photography post-production stuff like Photoshop. I know some of you are familiar with Photoshop in here. Levels, right? Let's talk about levels for a second. In the levels of Photoshop, it gives you a histogram of that picture, all right? And you'll see it here in just a second. But a histogram basically can help you determine the exposure of that photo. So basically, here's a histogram, and it's probably one of the most important features of the camera. And all you need to know tonight, take away from histograms, is you're familiar with a mountain, right? Like a mountain in a valley area. A perfect histogram kind of looks like a mountain in the middle and then coming down. And we'll talk about these jaggedy edges in just a second, but just know if the majority of the blackness is kind of looks like a mountain in the middle going down is in that histogram, that's generally a good exposure of that photo. So histograms, it's a graph that gives a relative amount of light and darkness in a picture. Each square of a histogram represents a pixel of brightness, The histogram displays every pixel collected. 0 is true black, and 255 is true white or pure white. And so you'll notice in the middle on this histogram, it says at the top there, some terms you might have heard of in post-production. Shadows, midtones, and highlights. Midtones, or otherwise called tonal ranges, is really where you want your histogram to set at on your camera. And like I said, some of your cameras allow you to turn the histogram on where you can see it. Some of them don't, but most of them do. And you'll learn where that's at this semester if you have it. But with the histogram, you can basically determine while you're looking at something before you take it, by looking at the histogram, if it has or doesn't have good exposure value. Tonal range is where most of the pixels are found, and you want most of your pixels in the tonal range or the midtones. You want most of them in there. And then kind of from the left, work its way up to the middle, and then a little hump, and then work its way down. Well, let's switch here. See if I have a better one on this one. Oh, let's reload it. Come on. I might have to switch Wi-Fi's maybe. Yeah, hang on just a second. Let me download it and see if it views better. There we go. Okay, so let's look at this picture real quick. You've got, you can analyze your picture by looking at the histogram. There's no perfect histogram. And so here's the histogram of this image here. And so you'll notice there's not a lot of tonal ranges here, not a lot of broad tonal ranges in the middle, which you can tell by just looking at it then. It's probably a little darker image and has like a lot of shadows and highlights in it, but not much tonal range. And if you look at this picture just as it is, you can see that because it's got a lot of mountainous stuff here on the left. It's dark. The stuff that is light is kind of really, really light, really bright. So it's kind of like a lot of highlights, a lot of shadows, not much midtone. You see that? And so the histogram shows that. Very few midtones, plenty of highlights and shadows. This is an average histogram, plenty of midtones. The ideal subject, because the camera can get most of the midtones, most camera meters have no problem reading the scene. In fact, some of your cameras will not allow you maybe to take a photo until the histogram is at a certain area of midtones in the middle. In fact, maybe you've come across this in bad lighting and you've tried to push your button halfway down, push it then all the way down. It's like, won't do anything, won't do anything, won't do anything. In fact, it might actually beep at you and say, you don't need more light, need to use flash or something like that. Anybody had that happen before? Had to use flash maybe on your photo? That's using, or your camera's using the histogram to determine that, whether you have it on or not, to where you can see it. Here we have a dog on the left on a beach on a bright day. So you can tell just by that, probably it's going to be washed out a little bit, which if you look at this one, it goes towards the highlight side, okay? Towards the highlight side, not towards the midtone or towards the shadow on the left. Low key would be a lot of shadows, That's what this one portrays. All right. Now, one of the things you'll notice here on the underexposed photo, which this one is, there is kind of a nice peak and then coming down, but it's real jaggedy. Anytime you see real jaggedy or leaning one towards the other and a whole bunch of wasted space or flat line space here, that's usually underexposed. Underexposed means does not have enough light for the sensor to get a good outcome of all the pixels. On the right side, the valleys towards the left, very choppy. In fact, over on the very right, they have what's called clipped highlights. And clipped highlights are like these right here, actually, or what this is representing here is this right here. Clipped highlights cannot be recovered in post-production because they're clipped, they are fragmented, and in post-production, you really can't do anything with it because there's nothing to do anything with, right? And so it's broken up to a place to where it's unusable if it's overexposed. Clipped highlights can never be recovered. Here's an example of a fairly normal good exposure. The shadows of the ironclad bars are coming here pretty good. Here, you'll notice the shadows are broken up here, 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 over here. So bad that you can't really, post-production, you really can't do anything with it. That makes sense? It is what it is. It's just one of those trash buttons pictures on your camera. So let's go into contrast now. Contrast basically is two types, low and high. On low contrast, basically both high and low, it's a measure of the difference between light and dark areas in your photo. So low contrast, it looks kind of blurry, right? High contrast looks choppy and kind of granulated and pixelated. You might have heard of that term. It's kind of pixelated. It actually looks like the water is kind of choppy here. On the top, it looks like it's really blurred out. Images on a low contrast tend to be flat or dull. Maybe this one was taken during fog time. Notice the peak, it does have a peak and comes down, but notice on the left and right, totally flatlined. Anytime you see that, a high middle end tonal range and nothing on left or right, it's very low contrast. In fact, the middle kind of looks like a column or something maybe that you might see, a pole in the middle, and that's about it. On the right side, it looks fairly good at first, maybe because of this, what we talked about. But notice it's very choppy, and again, mostly flatline. And what's going to tell you it's contrast, high contrast here, is the choppiness of the mountain peak on both going up and coming down. This one tends to have more intensity or strong daylight. A filter on Photoshop that you can do this with would be called sharpness. If you use a sharpness filter on Photoshop or sharp, it will do this. If you keep applying it to an image, it will give you kind of high contrast type of effect. These three histograms show 3 photos taken and what the histogram would look like if it was broken up for these 3 sections. So the very top section, notice it's taken up, that boat pretty much takes up the entire image. So the tonal range covers pretty much the entire histogram. But it's a very low tonal range because it takes up both vertically, horizontally, both that object does. Not that it's bad lighting, it just takes up the entire object. It takes up the entire spectrum of the photo. The middle one is a picture of a shadow of the building, and it has a fairly good peak and valley, but flat, but still okay because there's no clipped highlights or anything. And then the bottom actually takes a picture of the real building, and notice here it does have some clipped highlights, especially on the left. By the way, this would be here, this is over here. Kind of a flip thing on histograms. So top, if you put all three of them together then as one histogram, the top, middle, and bottom on the left, this is what you would end up with here. Top, middle, and bottom, you would end up with this one here, sorry. And this one here all put together into one image actually is not too bad. Because you don't have the flat line here. It's got some content here, and then it's going up towards the middle. That would be a good one. Let's look at this one right here. What about this one? Does this have more of a shadows going on, midtones, or highlights going on just from the histogram? Leaning towards the shadows, midtones, or highlights on this, you think? Just go and blur out whatever you think. Yeah, the left side is what? Is the left side shadows or highlights? Shadows. Shadows. Highlights here. So it's going to be what? Towards more of a shadow type. And the highlights that are in here are peaked, right? They're like really like sporadic. And that's going to be coming from this area actually over in here. All right. This whole area here is what's showing on that side there. So it's not a bad histogram. It just shows you where the objects are and where the light's at. It's just off-centered a little bit, more towards the shadow. In fact, this one's a little tended towards the dark side because the sun's over here somewhere, and most of it, and it does have some nice clippings here of the leaves, which I think actually is a pretty cool effect. So I don't think it's a terrible histogram. It just shows you where everything's at. It's not a bad one though. What about this one? This is looking on top of like a moth here. Fairly good light. So what does this one focus more on this one? Does it show us it's good tonal ranges, leaning towards highlights or shadows? What do you think? How many think it's good tonal ranges or mid-tone ranges on this one? And that's what it is because it's in the very middle, right? And it does have you notice, not flatlined here, it's not flatlined here. It's got a little going on here, and then coming up towards the middle, which means good exposure. Goldilocks and the three histograms. So you've got two dark, underexposed, looks like this, more towards the shadow side, right? Two light, overexposed, that way. And just to stop for a second, over here you've got, remember, true black, true white, all white, all black. And then this is just correct exposure. Towards the middle a little bit, not totally flat line on either side, pretty good. All right, so that's what you want to look for on your histograms. Now here we have a valley, kind of maybe fog in the background there. And so because it's a valley, it's foggy, the sun's hidden behind the clouds, we have here kind of a lot of shadows. Just by looking at the histogram, a lot of shadows, choppy midtones, and no highlights whatsoever. Really, really washed out highlights, totally washed out. And this would be like a overexposed type of setting. Overexposed. Because remember, if there's nothing here, it's generally overexposed. This one definitely is. Kind of just whitewashes everything, like putting a white tint over it, kind of with that. Here, again, foggy. A little better towards the bottom, which you're going to get this little peak here because of it. This nice peak here. Everything else is tended towards the overexposure and clipped area. Okay. This means a clipped area. And where in this picture do you think it's clipped at? Or where could it be clipped at, maybe, in this image? Where at? Yeah. You made the correct assumption. You said, yeah, I don't know if it's the mountains, because you don't know. Is it mountains? I don't know. They're all clipped, right? They're just literally all clipped. It could be mountains, could be clouds. We don't know because they're clipped. We're guessing they're mountains, but we don't know. So it's clipped because of this right here shows us it's clipped. This one right here, It's a little better. In fact, this one kind of, to me, is a kind of gives a kind of a artsy kind of effect, kind of a artistic kind of look that you might want sometimes. It's got the clipped or the highlight. It's got the kind of dark shadow, not much midtones at all. But what's cool about it, it kind of gives a kind of a, with these two being shadows and highlights and not much midtone, it kind of gives a kind of a negative effect. The film negative, kind of a negative flip effect on that, which you might want sometimes. This one's mostly dark, literally, little light, kind of like you're in a valley of a cave or something. So because that, heavy shadows. And where is this coming from in the image? Where are we getting the midtones at in the image at? Where's it coming from, you think? In this area? Yeah, up in this area is where the midtones are coming. And notice here, almost totally void, meaning most of this is going to be overexposed, which gives the total darkness that we have here. What about this one? This one actually on the monitor looks pretty cool. Let's see if I can turn off the light so you can see it. Maybe a little better. If you're looking at this on your monitor, you probably see something behind it, but it kind of gives a bluish tint kind of to it a little bit. You can see a little bit better that way. This one kind of looks like a horror film, kind of, you know, the beginning, because on your monitor it kind of looks bluish tint, these mountainous regions do here, and then you got the moon coming over, like a vampire or some type of werewolf movie or something maybe. So anyway, we can tell by the histogram though, all shadows, and that's it. That's all of it. But again, like we talked about last week and week before, there's sometimes you do break the rules on your histogram because you want this type of effect. You want a kind of a cool effect. And you can do that by breaking the rules sometimes when it comes to histograms. So if you want a kind of a bluish, tinted kind of photo, this is what the histogram would look like on a night type photo. This one's totally washed out, maybe after a big snowstorm. And we can tell on the histogram it's totally overexposed. Totally overexposed. But I think it looks pretty cool. Again, might be the outcome you're looking for possibly at times. So the histogram, even though we kind of know what a good one looks like, that doesn't mean something like this is bad. It just means you should know what a histogram looks like by looking at it, what the photo's going to look like. If it's overexposed, underexposed, if it's just right as far as exposure. But there are times where you want something overexposed or you want something underexposed, okay? There might be times you want that. Either way, though, just knowing it is important. We've all taken pictures like this, maybe at 4th of July, or people are over on the weekends and we take our camera out and take a photo, and our flash turns on because it won't let us take a picture in pitch dark. And so maybe there's no lights around us at all, probably isn't. And so notice the photo gets a picture of the object pole, the kid hanging off of it. You see a couple people in the background, but everything else is pitch dark. So if we look at the histogram, it mimics that. All shadowy, and this is going to be based underexposed. And the underexposure comes from this area here, all underexposed. This area here comes from the actual tonal range here. This clipped area here comes from actually down in this area here where you can't even tell what it is, these clipped areas. So that's where it comes from. Now, we're going to look at some histograms as it pertains to settings on your camera. So here's a shutter speed of 1/180th of a second, pretty fast. Aperture 2.8, which is fairly small opening. And then ISO 50, which is very low ISO, probably the lowest setting for this camera. And notice, just from the histogram, it's leaning towards a very underexposed, dark photo. We can tell just by looking at the histogram. And let's see if the picture shows us that. So really the only clear object in this whole image is this here for the most part, right in here. Maybe a little bit of the trunk here of the tree or the tree trunk going out branches. Everything else is, you know, blah, kind of blurry, right? But we can tell that from the histogram without looking at it. Here, is this overexposed or underexposed histogram? Overexposed. Remember, towards the right's over, left is under. It's also clipped a lot. It has a few good values and tonal ranges. And where does these tonal ranges come from on the picture? The left side, right side, or middle? How many says left side? Okay, that's where it's at, left side, right? Middle's pretty well washed out. Right side, totally washed out. And as you can see on the histogram, when you first start reading your histogram, you basically have to take whatever the histogram is showing you and flip it. And that's what the image kind of looks like. If we were to take this image here, or this histogram, and go like this, you would see most of the tonal stuff here and the white stuff here. All right. So this is shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, same f-stop, bumped up the ISO even more. And when you bump up the ISO, you're going to even add more whitewashing to the photo. More white, more light. Here's a shutter speed of 1/160th of a second, 160th of a second, f8. Very little light hole coming in with f8. ISO 200. And so hardly any tonal ranges, a lot of shadows, highlights, and even maybe some clipped areas here. All right. And very or little no tonal at all. It's pretty much all kind of like a silhouette of the object there in front of the picture frame or window frame, right? You don't really even tell what it is because it's too dark. There might be settings for this though where you can make it lighter. You can take ISO and keep bumping it up a little bit higher, and that will brighten it up. You could actually take the f-stop and bring it down a little bit. A lower f-stop would widen up the aperture to bring more light in as well. So there's some tricks you can do to brighten up this. Here we have a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, 2.8 f-stop. ISO's unknown, but it looks like it's towards sunset, which by the way, the two times to take a photo that's the best outside is sunset and sunrise. It's your best colors of nature on both those two times, like early morning, 6 o'clock, right when the sun's coming up, 5:30, 6 o'clock, and then right as the sun's going down, whatever time that is, or depending on the time zone that we're in, and also depending on the daylight savings that we're in at the time. So this one shows us what about the histogram? What is it that this histogram shows us is going on? If we were just looking at that and not even pretend the picture's not there, what could you tell about the histogram on this? About the image? Yeah.
You're gonna have a lot of shadows, but you're also gonna see a little bit of color from the midtones.
Yeah. And what about lightness or sharpness? Any of that in this one?
You're not getting very much light.
Not much at all, right? And so, yeah, you've got some little bit of tonal range here, midtones, and actually in this area here. Everything else is right here. All this right here is all this is coming from shadow. You can still see it. You can definitely see it. Just because it doesn't have a lot of light, you'll also notice the whole image, because it doesn't have a lot of light. The histogram we've seen thus far is pretty much went all the way up here. But this one actually peaks it right here because of the low light setting. Dynamic range. This is basically the range at which your camera can record relative brightness and darkness. The dynamic range of a digital camera are not that big compared to film. So really digital cameras, even though terminology of dynamic range is in digital, it really doesn't apply as much as it does to film. So we're not going to focus on dynamic range at all. Okay, now let's get to contrast. This is just an article by a photographer, director of photography from Arizona Highways. He did a talk basically where he discussed awareness of light as it is in relationship to subjects in your photographs. It goes on and says light and shadow become integral parts of a composition when skillfully incorporated and should be your first consideration before setting up to make a photograph. When lighting conditions have been evaluated and the camera position chosen to take the best advantage of light-subject relation, the next step is composing it. Now, we've already talked about, I'll stop there for a second, the rule of thirds. Remember on the rule of thirds, you've got the dynamic of your viewfinder and splitting up your object or the photo, the subject, whatever it is you're taking a photo of, and putting the subject on one of these four quadrants and focusing in on that, okay, to kind of off-center it a little bit. And we talked about that. Well, he goes on and says, when you're composing a photograph, it's essentially an editing process, deciding what to leave in and what to leave out. Because for some of you, when you first start taking photos, we want to put everything in here, in the middle. For most of us, not for some of you, for most of us we do. We want to center everything and then fill it up. And we have to teach ourselves to force ourselves to put the objects in one of these four areas. And kind of, that means though, there's a lot of white space. There's a lot of blank space. When I was in design school, they called it white space. You have to teach yourself to put white space in your pictures because we want by nature to fill it up, right? Just like little kids when you give them crayons in the first grade, kindergarten, not first grade, but kindergarten, they want to fill up the whole page with colors. And the teacher has to teach them to stay in the lines. Same thing with our eyes. So decide what to leave in and what to leave out. There are accepted criteria for good composition. One applied will help you achieve visual harmony or dynamic tension. Faithfully following rules of composition will not necessarily cultivate a good photograph. The rules are intended more as guidelines and strict dogma, but they will help you design well-balanced images that are pleasing to the eye. While it may be a subject that initially attracts viewers to stop and look at an image, it's the artistry of the composition that holds them there. So what he's saying basically is you can take a picture of a beautiful scene, a beautiful person, a beautiful kid, a beautiful old person, young person, whatever, group of people. But how you compose that image is going to keep the viewers watching it longer and viewing it longer and wanting to view it longer by composing it correctly. So he goes over some basic elements that we're going to go over here on composing a photo correctly. So let's look at this first one. Even though it's not blown up too much, the focal point of this picture is the person on the ledge, by the way, the focal point. Now notice they're by no means the largest part of this photo, right? The object of the tree, the mountains that she's standing on, the mountains above, beyond, and in the background is much more bigger in the picture, but she's the object, all right? And notice it falls in the rule of thirds on the upper right quadrant of the photo. And when you first look at this photo, compositionally, when I first looked at it, my eyes go to the tree on the left. I don't even see her till after I see the tree. I see her first, or the tree first, then her on the ledge. How many else saw that when you saw it the first time? Because your eye naturally does that. And that's what you want to do when you take the photo. The person taking this photo thought of that. I'm going to put this person compositionally with that tree standing there, and people are naturally going to go toward the larger object, but then flow towards her. And then lastly, I see everything else around. It's kind of like the photographer puts you in where she's standing, kind of. You see the tree first, see her second, then you're like, whoa, that's a pretty cool view. In fact, you kind of wonder what's beyond the scene to the right. What's beyond that? And that's maybe the feeling the photographer wanted you to have. A lot of times good composition makes you want more of the image. It doesn't make you want less or say that's too much. It makes you always want more, and that's a good thing, right? When you go to a good restaurant or you go to a nice recreational place, the people that run it want you to want more when you leave. So you come back, right? Well, I didn't get to try that, or I didn't get to do that, or what's that over there? That's the same thing with photography. You want people to be thinking of what's beyond what you took. So it's usually best to have the one main subject as the focal point because the photograph can successfully tell only one story. The main subject can be an object or several. You may decide to include a second subject, but make sure nothing detracts from the focal point. Lacking a good focal point, strong center of focus forces a viewer to search for something to observe, eyes seeking and not finding no resting place. So always give a good focal point is his point on that one. Prominence and composition, so that all elements are subordinate. Even though she's pretty much the smallest object in the image, she is a focal point. And because she's a focal point, everything else comes subordinate to her. So even if it's small, you can get prominence by composing empty space around it. So rule of thirds we've already talked about, but I'll mention what he says on it. So the exact center of any composition is not satisfying place for the eye. Within the subject placed in the center, the viewer is less likely to explore, and it's boring, by the way. In fact, it's preferable to keep the viewer's eye moving. To create movement in your photograph and avoid static bullseye, use a rule of thirds to do that. For off-center placement, it's a traditional way to create a well-balanced composition that has been used by artists for centuries. Picasso used it, Van Gogh used it in his photos and photography, not photography, photography, he had digital camera. Used it in their paintings and drawings, and so Michelangelo used rule of thirds in their paintings and drawings. And so to apply the rule of thirds, imagine the scene of the viewfinder in vertical and horizontal, horizontally and vertically, similar to tic-tac-toe. Lay it over your scene. Place the main subject and other elements of your composition along the grid lines or one of the points. I call them quadrants, four quadrants, where the grid lines intersect. Employ the rule of thirds not only helps avoid symmetrical composition, but also provides a pleasing proportion of space around the main subject to prevent distracting tension between the focal point and the frame, edges of the frame. So in this example here, the mountainous region on the left is a focal point. Everything else is supporting that focal point. Even though that's really the smallest part of the image, everything else is focusing towards that, pointing towards that. Like when I first see this, I see the bushes here on the front bottom square. And then my eyes naturally start flowing towards, oh, what is that beyond? Oh, that's the mountainous region. That's a focal point. So your focal point necessarily should never be the first thing you want the people to see. It's usually the last thing or middle, usually the middle or last, never the first. And that just takes practice on taking photos. Let's go to this one right here. A common compositional faux pas occurs when the horizon is positioned directly through the middle of the frame, bisecting the scene. So if we utilize the rule of thirds, the horizon is placed near one of the grid lines. This will lower or raise the horizon in the frame and give emphasis either to a dramatic sky or an interesting foreground. The rule, by the way, for sky, land, sea is sky or land or sea. In this case, you just have land and sky. It's a 1/3, 2/3 thing. So you got 1/3 land here, 2/3 sky. You could also flip it and be 2/3 land, 1/3 sky. All right, that's generally the rule when you're taking photos. Here we have simplicity is the next one he talks about. The best way to present a clear message in a photograph is to keep the composition simple. The fewer elements you have to work with, the easier it is to design a pleasing image and control the viewer's eye movement. There are several ways to simplify composition, but the primary method is to move in closer to the subject. Photojournalist Robert Capa said at best, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. That's a very good statement. If the pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. So that's not using your zoom, that's physically walking closer to the subjects, which a lot of times we don't want to do. We think, well, further back we get more. No, by going in, it's usually better. Whether you physically move the camera in or you zoom in, getting closer allows you to fill the frame with the subject, paring the composition down to essential elements. It removes visual distractions from the edges of the frame, eliminates superficial, can't even spell, can't even read, whatever that word is, elements, and defocuses the background. Shallow depth of field helps to isolate the subject from a busy background by blurring objectionable clutter and by even creating soft pools of complementary color behind it. And so in this example here, it's a pool of water, has the rocks around it as the complementary items towards that pool of water, and bringing the subject in and making it a relaxing image and simple image. The next one is using leading lines. Leading lines is basically taking a photo with the intent of using the lines, the natural lines within that photo. So another compositional technique to create energy and movement is using leading lines, whether the graceful curves or dynamic diagonals. All lines should lead the viewer's eyes to the focal point. Be careful of using leading lines that can also work against you by directing the eye away from the subject. If the leading lines of the photograph are in two, lead them in the right, leading it right out of the image. So in this example here, the leading lines go right to the main focal point, which is a mountainous region in the back. But if you have more than one type of leading line, it can cause some problems. So here is some stuff to consider. Let the lines in your composition decide if the scene should be shot horizontally or vertically. So if you're taking a picture of a building, horizontally, vertically, a tall building, vertical, right? Makes sense, right? You're taking a picture of a river, horizontal, vertical, horizontal. So what you're taking a picture of, that subject determines, the lines in that picture determines horizontal or vertical, or portrait or landscape, okay? Second bullet, beware of white or light areas in your composition. The viewer's eye will always go to the brightest part first. So eliminate any very bright spots that will pull attention away. And you can do that by moving your frame away from it or moving yourself to a different position. Look for repetition of shapes and textures, patterns, create rhythm and motion. One of the first things too, you try to, when you first start taking photos, you don't like wind or stuff floating in the air, like wind or leaves or clouds. Those look awesome in photos. Anything moving like that. It does give texture and movement to the photos. Composing boldly using sweeping diagonal lines. Long horizontal lines can be static and visually boring. Conversely, diagonal lines can add visual energy. And what he's talking about diagonal lines is diagonal. So instead of normally taking a picture of, say, a river like this, just a river horizontally, you may position yourself to where instead of the river being like this in your image, it might actually be going like this in your image. And then here's the land going like that. And so it's kind of a horizontal or diagonal line versus a vertical or horizontal line. Try using a wide angle lens. You don't need to worry about that. But the next one he mentions here, composing foreground, middle ground, background, is very important. And I'll stop. I won't read the rest of this, but I want to mention about foreground, middle ground, background. An example is it's a autumn day. There's leaves on the ground, okay? And you're wanting to take some photos of your family, maybe jeans and a shirt, sitting in the leaves, sitting on a hill or something. Well, compositionally, what would help add depth to that image would be if you put leaves in front of your family, like a big pile of leaves, and then put them behind it on a ground that doesn't have any leaves on it. Those leaves actually are going to give some depth to that photo. Another way is by putting any object in front of the subject is going to give depth to it. Even a branch coming into it sometimes gives depth to it. Whereas before we might be thinking, the leaves are distracting or the branch is distracting, but really it's not. It gives depth to the image. Kind of, we can't take 3D images, but it's the next best thing by adding something in front of the subject. You see photographers do that all the time when you're going into a portrait studio. They have all the little props and stuff. A lot of times for kids, they'll put something in front of the kid, whether it be a bucket or a ball or whatever that case may be. And what that's for is not just to amuse a kid, which it does, it also adds depth to the photo. All right. So putting something in front of the subject will help give tons of depth to your photo. All right. Let's go to the in class this week, and I'll turn the lights on. What you're going to do for the in class is get your camera out, and you're going to look at the settings on your camera, all the settings. You might have a dial on your camera, you might have a menu on your camera, no dial, either way. We all have some type of settings, like, portrait, aperture, manual, auto, whatever. So here's what you're going to do for your in class. You're going to look at that dial, and you're going to go to the in-class exercise, and you're going to locate the dials on your camera, wherever it's at. Might be a virtual dial, might be a digital dial, and you're going to look at whatever your camera settings are. Like this example I gave was this camera had auto, aperture mode, ISO mode, movie mode, close-up, sports, PAM, and TV. Whatever yours has, you're going to submit that in the in-class exercise. So go ahead and spend a few moments doing that. You are able to enter in via a text box that submission. So with your camera out, I'll switch it over here to students to where you guys can see what you should see as a student. Let's switch it over here. There it is. Should be on the right side. You're going to click the submit assignment, and as soon as you click the submit assignment, type in 1 through whatever you've got on your camera and submit it. All right. If you need help, I'll help you as I walk around. If you don't have your camera with you right now, which you should, do this as soon as you get home. That'll be awesome. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, you might actually find some new stuff on your camera that you didn't know you had. And while you're going through these settings, I just want to mention, if you don't have a physical manual for your camera, like a hard copy, by next week, or at least 2 weeks, won't really need a couple weeks. I would say go online and Google the make and model of your camera if you don't have a physical manual. And most all of your camera manufacturers will have a PDF of your manual online on their website that you can download. I do recommend you doing that and saving it to your Dropbox or whatever you use to save files, cloud, Microsoft, Google, whatever you use. That way you can access it from anywhere, maybe even your phone. Most of your phones today you can access and read PDFs just fine, or your tablet. That way, if you're in a pinch and you want to, or if you have some downtime and you want to have something to do, it's always good to read your manual, which probably most of you haven't. And that's going to help you learn some of the settings that your camera has. It's going to help you learn how to use it when we get to that section. And so if we know exactly where it's at, what it does, it's going to be just that much further along as we go along the semester. You got C okay? Do I need to? So, see okay? Yeah. Yeah. So what you would put in on yours would be if you go all the way to the left, go to the intelligent mode, and then go down. Easy. Yeah. So what I would want is on that left side there, keep going down. EV, go to the next one. Single picture, continue down, keep going. Those are the ones that I want actually. Yeah. Well, you can put those on too. I'm thinking you're gonna have different menus for each one of them, right? It changes all of it. So yeah, you could do either one. You might do like a global, what is it, whatever that iAuto, and what's that? What's the program? Yeah, you can definitely do that. Yep. Yep. So definitely put those four in there. If you want to put, one of the branches of those four, that'd be fine. Okay. How's everybody doing? How many still working on your settings? Still working on, raise your hand real quick. Still working on your settings? Okay. A few moments there. And the reason I have you do settings now is before we get into, like this week, we are going to be playing with the ISO setting on your camera and the auto white balance, which everybody should probably have some idea of auto white balance, but if you don't, you'll be using that. You might not have ever used ISO. You will be using that this week. And this also helps you know kind of what everybody has to work with as far as your settings go. All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap up that. Hopefully you're almost done or done already. We're going to talk about your take home. We'll make sure you've got time to go over this. This is basically a contrast exercise. You're going to submit this week 3, in Foki, this exercise. In this exercise, I want you to walk around campus and other places in the next week, and you're going to take 3 pictures of using each of the below settings that give itself to good contrast. After transferring your files to your computer, you're going to label them and then upload them to week 3 album so we can go over them next week in class. And I put in bold, you're going to capture or caption each photo in Foki when you upload them, and you'll see what the captions are below here in a second. You're going to focus on the ISO setting, which you should know where it's at now by going over your settings on your camera, and white balance. On white balance, you're going to only focus on the auto and preset on your white balance, which we'll go over in a second. And do not use manual white balance. There will be a week we focus on just white balance where you get to play with that manual white balance, but not this week. So for ISO, you're going to use 3 ranges, okay? You're going to use low, medium, high. So if your ISO starts with 100, and then the next one's 200, and the next one's 300, that's what you're going to use. But your ISO might be like this. It might start with 80, then 100, then 120. It might be 100, 200, 300. Whatever the iteration of ISO is, first, second, and third, that's what you're going to use on your camera. Okay, the low one's going to be low, the middle one's going to be medium, and the high one's going to be high. So just note that right now. Just as long as you start with the lowest ISO and then add two, the next two is fine. So what we're going to do is, in just a second here, we're going to focus on 3 areas of photography: nature, people gathering, vehicles, and other, for a challenge if you want, like an other area of your choosing. So here we go for nature. You're going to find a nature area. An example I put down here was a gazebo by the student center. Okay. We'll say maybe tomorrow you go out there and you take 3 photos of the gazebo in the same setting that you're at. So what I mean by setting is not camera setting, but physical setting of yourself and the camera. So 3 photos in the same setting of that gazebo. All right. And you're going to take a 200, we'll say your ISO is 200, 300, 400. You're going to 200 ISO sunny white balance, a 300 ISO shady white balance, a 400 ISO auto white balance. Okay. So you'll label these when you upload them: Nature 1, Nature 2, Nature 3, Nature 1, 200 ISO sunny white balance, Nature 2, 300 ISO sunny white balance, and Nature 3, 400 ISO sunny white balance. You'll also choose the best contrast out of the 3. All right. And I'm forcing you to use, by the way, for each one of these settings we go over, each one of these nature, people gathering, and vehicle settings, I'm forcing you to use the same ISO and white balance together. So sunny will also always have the lowest white balance or lowest ISO setting. Shade will always have the medium ISO setting, whatever it is. And auto will have the high ISO. So if your ISO on your camera low is 100, and then medium's 200, 300, for every one of these photo settings, you're going to do the same. So we've done nature. Now let's go to people gathering. You're going to describe the setting of your camera, make the best, make the contrast, white balance and ISO, choose the best one out of the 3. People gathering, student center. You go inside the student center, you take 3 pictures. Again, let's say you're in front of Subway, I don't know. You're in front of Subway, you take 3 photos. Okay, the first photo, set the ISO to 200, set the white balance to sunny, take a photo. Then set the ISO to 300, set the white balance to shade, take it. Then 400 ISO, white balance to auto. Then you look at all 3 after you get home and you realize the middle one's the best. Okay, so when you upload these 3 images, you're going to label them as such and then put in the label best around the one that you like the best. Make sense? The next one is vehicles. This one, same deal as the last 2. The example I put here is the WTC parking lot. Again, 200, 300, 400, the same white balance. Sunny for the low, shady for the middle, and auto for the high. You'll upload them, label them, and then put best on the one that you like the best. The other is one of your choosing. So for this one, you can choose any other location you want to. I'll put an example here of Cherryville Mall food court, but it could be a park. It could be wherever around your house. And this one, same logic, 200. On this one though, notice I changed it up a little bit. All auto on this one. So 200, whatever your ISO settings are, it's going to be in that same as above, but instead of the sunny shade auto, it's going to be auto, auto, auto. Then you're going to choose the best out of that. So what this exercise is going to do is show you a couple things. What ISO does to the same setting that you're taking a photo of, okay? Same exact setting. Also what white balance does in the very same exact setting. And kind of what it will do to the contrast of those images. So I'm forcing you to use the same camera settings, but in different photo settings to show you what it looks like. Some of them may be indoors, some of them may be outdoors. But at the end of the day, you'll be able to play with what your camera does with all these different types of lighting areas, and also what white balance can do as well, because it might be the first time you play with white balance. So let me talk about white balance for a second. Some of your cameras might not be named like I put up here. It might not be sunny, shade, and auto. It might be, I don't know, sunlight. It might be shadow, and you should have auto. But these two names could be different than what I have on the board, on the assignment. Make sense? Questions on your assignment. Now let me show you what you're going to submit. Here's an example of what you'll submit in this week's assignment in Eagle. You'll submit number one, you'll submit the URL to your Foki photo folder, photo album. So here I have an example of mine, week 3 in Web225 on Foki. Then you'll just submit below that all the stuff you uploaded to Foki, but in label format, and you'll put in parentheses in nature, people, and vehicles, and other, which one you like the best. Pretty simple, right? So at the end of the day, you're going to have 12 photos that you'll submit, and again, it's subjective, subjectively decide which one you think is the best exposure outcome of the 3 photos per area. Okay? Questions? Yes. Yeah, the URL and then everything below, which is just a note of where you took it and then what you labeled it and the ISO. So everything I have here below example, what to submit is what you'll submit. Everything. Do I know? For Foki, you're going to have the actual label on the image. So when I look them on your Foki site, when I go to your Foki site, I should see a label on your Foki site that says MAL, I'll just use this as an example, but MAL 3400 ISO auto white balance. I'll have that. You'll actually have that in the caption of the photo. Okay. Any other questions? All right, we'll go forth and have fun with ISO and auto white balance. You'll enjoy it. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Yeah. Where's one now? Oh yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah, mostly for your to get ISO setting, for the most part, if you go on your camera, it looks like, I would say go to the M mode or the P mode, one of the two. Let's try the M first. Manual. Okay. And then click on your menu. And you should have an ISO button on the left side. In fact, there's white balance, there's quality, and then ISO. See it up here, see right here. So these buttons here to the left, well, it's actually going to show up whichever your selection button is. Yeah, that's just click on the menu bar. Yeah, click on it again. Bring it out. What do you have it set on? Manual? Right. So you want to go to the camera settings. There you go. White balance is that one. Keep going down. ISO is right below that. Go back one. Yep. Yeah, we're going for 10. We'll let's go to shady. We'll go to shade, yeah. Let's see, sunny, direct sunlight. Direct sunlight is what your sun's going to be. And then if we go back one, I thought I saw ISO there somewhere. Go to the ISO sensitivity setting on yours. And you turn it on. Yeah, there you go. Sensitivity. So it's on auto by default. So here's where you're going to be 100, 125, and what, 160? Those are your low, medium, high. And then, so you should be able to set that. And it's going to be easiest to do the white balance first, looks like on your camera, and then you're going to switch the ISO second. Yeah. Well, is your focus auto? Is it set to auto on the switch? Okay, so you're good there. That's all I got to worry about. Don't switch out to N. What, on your lighting? Let's go into this lighting here. You can turn up manual mode. So for manual mode, you want the flash on because you're controlling everything basically. To get something to happen with this close, what we'd have to do is go to your menu. Like we did earlier, go down. Choose. Starting to see something, so if we make it a little higher. It is so good. Yeah. So take that 1600 by 7. There you go. So in manual mode, literally you're controlling it. It lets you do whatever you want. But again, the downside of that is you got to live in the so this gets ISO. So higher ISO here, but something like flash. So if we use flash in here. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
I actually worked at the Cherryville Mall.
Oh, did you?
Court.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I do maintenance.
Oh, okay.
So I'm there a lot. Is it okay if I take pictures?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, you definitely do that.
Yeah, 'cause it gets actually pretty interesting when it's on like late Monday nights when there's absolutely no one there.
Yeah, just as long as you know. Well, the weird thing about Cherryville Mall sometimes is,
The lighting.
yeah, you don't want to take pictures. They might frown upon you. You already know that working there, taking pictures of groups of people or
Yeah.
something.
That's
Yeah,
why I figured Monday
might not
nights
like
so there's
that, but-
literally nobody there.
yeah, yeah.
Because I
yeah.
close on Monday nights.
And
so
you work there, so you know better than I about that stuff. So.